years ago, Ethel Turner and I on a whim drove to New Gloucester to hear a talk about barns. I was so impressed that I started taking notes like crazy. Everyone thought I was crazy. And I was very impressed, and the speaker there was Don Perkins, who knew an awful lot more than I thought there was to know about barns. Then last fall, I believe, I had another chance to go hear Don in Bethel, and this time Ethel didn't go, and it turned out to be a different talk. So I'm still impressed, and I thought he would work well for us because we have lots of old barns here in Otisfield. And when I got back from the talk, which was mostly about English tie joints, and I didn't know what they were, and I still don't know what they are. I went out to my barn and took some flash pictures and emailed them off to Don and said, "Have I got an English tie joint?" And he said, he emailed me back immediately and said, "Yes." And he wanted to go on the National Register of Historic Places or try. So I was so impressed with that he's here today to tell us all more about barns or English tie joints. You know, and after he finishes talking, if you're impressed, you can buy one of his books over there for $20, and he will put his signature on the front of it. Anything else I should say, Don? Okay. I was going to tell about your distinguishes a career as a writer, but it's too late, so I'm going to sit down.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. Well, it's great to be here today, this beautiful day. Otisfield is good barn country, and the barns are shining bright in the sun today. Jean has been to one of my talks, and she mentioned it was a different talk. That's because my book has now come out. So the talk is more geared to a statewide survey of what I've learned. As opposed to the first talk she came, it was much more of a Southern Maine, locally based talk. Whereas now it's the Barns of Maine, it's the whole state, from Arundel to Aroostook. So it's a much more comprehensive piece. I'm going to read from the book today, and I would encourage questions as we go. Just raise your hand. I like to keep this informal, keep this fun. I'm going to read from the book, but before I start with this first slide here for a reason. You may notice this 1880 right here, and come to find out that was the high point of farming in Maine. It didn't get any bigger than that, which surprised me. I thought it would be right before the Great Depression in the 20th century. But 1880 was it. And it was the Victorian age. It gave us our grandest barns, our biggest barns. And this one is in Milo, near Dover Foxcroft. And they have a lot of slate quarries up there, Monson, Brownville. And this is all slate. The cupola is roofed in slate. The whole roof is slate. These little additions on each side are slate. Just amazing. And I love how this cupola is turned on a 45. Has a beautiful horse weather vane up there. Just a perfect example of kind of the zenith of Maine barns. And it's still standing. So it's a great example.
Don?
Yeah?
Would you mind just giving us a little bit of your background?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, this whole thing started as a newspaper column in the Greater Gloucester Independent back in 2007. I was a freelancer for them. So I had to come up with my own topics, and I like to do series on things. And I did old cars for a while, I did tractors, antique tractors, and woodworkers, and then I thought, being a former carpenter before I started writing, I thought barns might be interesting. I wasn't sure though, I wasn't sure. I broached it to a few people, and they were kind of, might be a little dull. But I found out it to be very interesting. The series went on for 20 weeks straight. The community wrote in letters to the editor, all very positive. And everybody said you should make a book about it. So I was a writer, a freelance writer for a while. I wrote for the Press Journal for 7 years. I wrote for the Advertiser Democrat in Norway. Did a barn series there for a year and a half. That came out monthly for them. So through solicitations to publishers and getting my name out there and speaking at places like New Gloucester back in 2010 or 11, probably 2010. I found a publisher and it came out last September, and that's now in its second printing. And I'm having a great time with it. It's a lot of fun. I feel very fortunate as a writer to have found a subject that's resonating with people. So many writers struggle, but I seem to have hit on something here.
Did you speak for the Harrison Historical Society? Was that
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so that was you.
Yeah, that was before the book came out.
You impressed my mom.
Oh, good. So, as you can see, it's the Barns of Maine, our history, our stories. I learned early on that the people, there's a lot of good people stories here that should not be ignored. A lot of barn books are very narrow in their focus, architectural, talk about just the construction. But I learned early on that there's a lot of human stories too. And so I made sure to incorporate them in the book. And I'm going to start with one. This barn, many of you may have seen in Bridgeton. This is the Temperance Barn, owned by the Bridgeton Historical Society. And it's called the Temperance Barn for a reason. Does anybody know that? Because a time-honored beverage on hand at each and every barn raising in the 19th century was rum. A barrel of rum was the traditional thing in a barn raising. These upright teetotaling Yankees chose not to do that, so it's called the Temperance Barn. It's 1830s, and one of the kids who grew up there, his name was Edwin Fitch, and he grew up there in the 1840s, 50s, and then went off to fight in the Civil War. He was taken prisoner, but he returned to the farm, and he wrote a diary of his whole life, and he has some great anecdotes when he was a kid in the barn in the 1840s. Although we lived in cold and sterile Maine, we did not lack for many luxuries of life, Edwin wrote. Edwin also described how the attic provided a place for children to play, as they were not allowed to play inside the main house in those days. Quote, the attic was one vast room where we youngsters were monarchs and always surveyed. When the weather would not permit us to stay outdoors, we had great times here. The barn was another place free from the constraints of instilled order found in the proper rooms of the family home. If a young boy were to kiss a girl, he had a much better chance of doing so in the barn, especially when the corn was ready. After corn harvesting came husking. It was the custom in those days to fill the barn floor with unhusked corn and then ask the young people to come and husk it. We all enjoyed these occasions, a regular lark. Many of our neighbors made a gala event of it, asking all the girls to be there and help get the husking out of the way early so dancing could begin. There was a rule that whoever found a red ear was entitled to a kiss. There was some rivalry among the boys when they selected partners. Some of the girls would hide their red ears if their partner was not to their liking. Okay. So like I said, this whole thing started as a newspaper column. This is a place in Oxford up Route 26. Route 26 and Station Road. And I wrote for the Advertiser Democrat there, and I had to find my own barns, which was a challenge. I live in Raymond, so I don't really know folks in Oxford very well, or the surrounding area. So I just had to find these barns. Hopefully word of mouth led me to some. And the people had to be willing to showcase them to the community and stuff. So it was a challenge. So I was just driving up 26 one day, looking for a prospect, when I spied this. And this is the only newspaper article I chose to have reprinted here. It's called Talking with the Barn Generation, Oxford. Last Saturday was an interesting day. With the prospects of one barn I planned to feature for this series falling through, I was in dire need of a plan B. Thus, I headed up Route 26, searching for another barn to explore, with no idea where I might end up or who I might meet. I soon spied a handsome-looking small white barn at the corner of Route 26 and Station Road. Ah, an English barn, I thought. That's interesting. I haven't written about too many of these. It was built on a slope, and I spied what looked like an old manure basement. Although it appeared this barn had been finished off inside and perhaps had other uses now, I still thought it was a nice prospect. I parked the car and proceeded toward the front door. Come on in, a friendly old gentleman said, almost immediately as he fumbled with the doorknob and gestured me inside. I was surprised how welcoming Bob Bartlett was. Most of the time, when encountered with a stranger, folks will hang in the doorway and give me a good look over, at which point I present my card and explain I'm interested in their barn. Mr. Bartlett didn't really seem to care why I'd come. He promptly offered me a seat in his living room, and we began to chat. I write a series about barns for the Advertiser Democrat in Norway, I explained, handing him my card. Barns, he said, as he gave both me and the card a closer examination. I noticed you have a small English barn here, I asked. Can I take a look? What, that thing, he said? That's not old, at least not what I would call old. It's sawn timber, maybe 1900. I'll show it to you in a minute. With that, I began thinking I should move on, that my earlier suspicions were right. This wasn't really an old barn at all. However, Bob Bartlett showed no signs of letting me off that easy. As he sat in his easy chair, he packed his pipe and struck a match to a fresh quantity of Captain Black. His dog rested comfortably on the couch. How long have you lived here, I asked, trying to feel things out. Oh, about 20 years, he said, getting his pipe burning to his liking. I grew up in Montville, near Belfast. I was the town manager for Norway. I spied some woodworking magazines on his coffee table and noticed a beautiful old bookcase with glass doors along the far wall. It was tall, probably 7 feet high, with nice ornamentation at the top. As a former woodworker, I thought this was a potential point of commonality that might break the ice for us. I illuminated my woodworking background and asked what kind of wood the case was and if I might take a closer look. Sure, he said, help yourself. What looked scary from across the room turned out to be something different. I wasn't quite sure what it was, perhaps mahogany. I did notice some nicely contrasting maple burl accents. Bob guessed it was walnut, but I could tell he wasn't quite sure either. It was when I looked closer that I saw the old books inside. My interest was immediately piqued at seeing such titles as Keeping Livestock Healthy, 1942, The Principles of Dairying and Animal Sanitation and Disease Control, and there were others. I just knew there had to be some solid information on barn history within these pages, like how disease factors changed elements in our barns. Getting a date range in some of these modifications and the subsequent regulations is notoriously difficult. Areas of great interest to researchers like me. I used to be a tester for the Waldo County Dairy Herd Improvement Association, Bob explained, as I inquired about the books. I used to test milk for butterfat content. I tried probing him again on the barn and whether or not I could take a look. "We'll go in a minute," he said, taking another drawer in his pipe. "I don't move too fast." I sat back down and we started talking barns. I told him where I lived. He asked if I had, or had ever been a farmer. I said no. He then asked me about rooftop cupolas and whether I knew what they were used for. He was testing me, probing someone half his age on an area of interest usually known by older, more seasoned folks. "They're for ventilating the buildings," I answered. "They started appearing around 1850 or 60 and got pretty fancy in the late Victorian age." Bob nodded in agreement. I explained how keeping manure in a manure basement became all the rage among farmers in the early to mid-19th century, and that air quality in these barns eventually became problematic, especially in the winter, when animals spend little, if any, time outdoors. The moisture from the manure, combined with the breath of the animals, would rise and condense on the underside of the cold roof boards, I explained. This also made the hay unpalatable to the animals. But cupolas served a purpose in summer too, I continued, because you wanted to keep your hay cool. Bob concurred and broke in. "Putting in green hay would give you problems," he said, referring to the composting action of moist hay. As any seasoned farmer knows, these conditions created immense heat within a mound of loose hay and could start a fire through spontaneous combustion. Indeed, many barns burned this way. Wanting to gain additional credence with Bob, I remarked how a farmer I knew told me a common practice was to put salt down between layers of questionably dry hay, as it would draw the moisture out. Yes, Bob agreed with a nod. The animals probably like to taste it as well. We were beginning to hit it off nicely, and I sensed he enjoyed talking to someone about farming and barns. Soon enough, we ventured through the kitchen to the barn I had been inquiring about. It was quickly apparent that this building had never had any animals housed within. Instead, previous owners had made a fine-looking garage with all the elements of a barn. A paved ramp led up to a nice sliding door with an old granite block and stone that had been mortared in nicely, giving it the appearance of an old barn foundation. And its multi-levels, roof pitch, and proportions gave it the hallmarks of a small barn. But this is just Bob's garage and woodworking shop. Details of his construction, including rough-cut dimensional lumber fixed with modern hardware such as joist hangers, suggest this building is 50 years old at best. It was getting cold, so we came back in. I was eager to hear about Bob's days as a dairy tester and his memories of barns, but I didn't want to overstay my welcome. One question in particular stood out. Ever seen a barn burn, I asked? 1941. I saw a barn burn, yes, he said. Father woke me up at 2 in the morning, said the barn was on fire. I got up and looked out the window. It was all ablaze, 86 feet long. We don't know what started it. October 20th, 1941. Bob was about 10 years old at the time, and because the house was connected to the barn, everything burned flat. Their livestock was lost. Bad wiring was ruled out. Even though the Rural Electrification Act of 1936 provided low-cost loans to many, the Bartletts didn't have power because they simply couldn't afford it. After the fire, Bob said his father decided it was cheaper to relocate the family than to rebuild. As we talked, we concurred that farms and barns are disappearing. Knowledge about barns is fleeting too. Bob said it's too bad that many young people have romantic visions of farming. They don't realize how much work is involved, he said. You can't take a vacation. I was fortunate to happen upon Bob Bartlett and engage him in conversation. And he was kind enough to lend me some of his old books. Perhaps some of the information contained within will grace these pages in the coming weeks and months. A big thank you goes out to Mr. Bartlett, who was part of a generation that's a veritable storehouse of the common barn life and its fading memories. So that was 2011. The book came out in September of 2012, and I had to make an addendum to this story. Sadly, Bob Bartlett left us before this book went to print. He passed just before Christmas, December 23rd, 2011. So, I'm doing this none too soon. Many of these folks are leaving us or are no longer able to tell their stories. Stanley Hall at the Rotary in Wyndham is another person I did not get to him in time. I lament that. So, that's a little of the people side of it. Let's get into more nuts and bolts of it here. Okay, well, what does the word barn mean? Well, it's a Middle English term from the 12th century. It's a combination of the words barley and house. So it's essentially a place where you store barley. And it's why the words barn and barley share a common spelling. It has nothing to do with livestock at all. This is a building based on grain storage. Barns are built out of bents. A bent is a noun in barn building, and there's 3 bents here, one ready to be stood up. And these can be built in a number of different ways. They're made with mortise and tenon joinery. You've probably all heard that. The mortise is the hole, and the tenon is the protruding part. And this is very old technology. This is much older than New England, or really barns in general. The pyramids were built 5,000 years ago in Egypt, and they haul stones on wooden sleds. Those sleds have been found in excavations to be built with this mortise and tenon joinery. So as I traveled the state for the book, I discovered that there are basically 3 generations of phases of traditional wooden barn that we went through. The first generation is the English barn. And it's called that because that's what the colonists, this is New England, right? That's what the colonists brought here with them from the old country. And what signifies an English barn, what determines an English barn as English, is the placement of the doors. Losing my pointer. Sorry, I got one. The doors on an English barn are always placed under the eaves of the roof. Okay, they're not placed on the end. It's under the eaves. And they would have another set around the back side. And the farmer wanted it that way because when he opened both sets of doors, he wanted the wind to blow through the shortest dimension of his building for the hand threshing of grain. And that's what is going on here in the photo. You'll see this stuff blowing out here. When the farmer brought his grain in, be it oats, barley, wheat, whatever, he put it on the threshing floor and he beat it with a flail. I don't know if you folks have seen that. 2 pieces of rod or stick connected with a piece of leather or cord. And so he would beat the grain, thrash it, thrash it, and it would crack the outer husk of the grain and start getting it processed. And he would sweep up, after he'd done that, he would sweep that up into a basket, or maybe 2 people would cradle it between a blanket. And if everything went as planned on a nice windy day, he'd throw all the doors open, toss it to the wind, and separate the wheat from the chaff. The lighter chaff would blow away, and the wheat would fall below. And what stopped it from blowing out of the barn entirely was a little board here called the threshold. Okay? That's where we get the term threshold. It's from threshing of grain. So you'll notice these barns are very simple. There's no ornamentation, there's no cupola, there's no fancy roof trim, there's no windows. And you'll see that the boarding is always vertical in an old barn. Why is that? It's because you didn't spend the money for the nails to side your barn. You would have sided your house, but you would not have sided your barn. It was just too expensive. So you would have put the boards on vertically because that would shed the water much easier. Okay, so after that first generation of barn, we came up with what's called the New England or Yankee barn. This is the barn that most of us are familiar with, right? It has the entrance now moved on the gable end, as opposed to here under the eaves. And we have a little ramp coming, and we put a long aisle parallel with the roof all the way down, right? This is a building more based on livestock than grain. The third and final generation of traditional wooden barn would be what we call the gambrel. And that's named after the gambrel roof. Okay? This is Stanley Hall's barn at the Rotary in Wyndham. And a big giveaway of this style, if you see this gambrel roof, it's a dead giveaway that the barn is after 1900. This is a 20th century phenomenon that came about mostly for a huge hayloft when farming became real commercial. It was still loose hay around 1900. But you see this gambrel style gives a hayloft equally as tall as the barn. So barns went through changes just like anything else, and a lot of these were driven by the following things. Grain to livestock farming, climate, expansion considerations, hay and manure went through several kind of phases. And then in the 20th century, disease came upon us, and we had to modify things, and we'll get into that in a little bit. As far as expansion, this was the first style, right? You can expand this barn by building to one side or the other, but it is pretty inefficient. You get further and further away from your central aisle, and if you build on the back, you end up diminishing its height because of the roof line. So they tried to expand these barns, but they found them pretty inefficient to do so. So that's when this came along. Now, with the aisle going down this way, if you want to expand your barn, you just add on to the rear, and you get a longer configuration of the same thing, and you're able to drive a horse and wagon down through the entire section of the barn. Very easy. So you can't talk about barns without talking about farming. This is interesting in the early days of farming. It turns out that Maine is not great farmland, right? People really didn't come here to farm anyway. They came here to lumber and fish, and they just farmed as kind of a way to get by those other things. Livestock fed on browse and had no barn to seek protection from predators. So you can think of a barn as also a protection from not just the elements, but also predators. An early barn was just a crib of logs. And you don't find too many barns before this date because of the French and Indian War, where most stuff was burned. And this is interesting. Old barns are often short. The wall height is pretty short. That's because oxen were the preferred draft animal. And that was mirrored in logging. If you look at Paul Bunyan, his companion was an ox. It was not a horse. So as we went further along, the barns tended to get a little taller because of horses. So there are regional differences. This was very interesting to me as I traveled the state for the book. You will find, this is the English, then we went here, then we went here. You'll find these styles everywhere throughout the state, but certain parts of the state are more partial to one than the other, which is interesting. Washington County, when I went up there, kind of an isolated section of the state, almost every barn there is this English style. Again, very plain building, no windows, hardly. Built right on a flat ground with no slope for a manure basement. Very basic building. And why is that? Well, as a barnologist, I propose they have a very strong English lineage there. So of course they would bring the barn from the mother country. And it's a very isolated section of the state that didn't, evolve too much. And when you think of the Maine accent, you usually think of Washington County. Well, it's interesting to learn that the Maine accent comes from England. They don't say they're ours, and neither do we. Most people came to New England from England. They came to Massachusetts and Boston, and then they came up to Maine. And places like Washington County being very isolated, they developed their own kind of dialect. So the barns didn't change particularly much there. And cedar shingles is almost the exclusive siding. And farming was never really big in Washington County. They're much more forestry, blueberries, shipbuilding, fishing. They never really get into agriculture like the rest of the state. So, some characteristics of barns up in that part of the state. They're often small for subsistence farms. This is interesting, a lot of hand-hewn frames, even after hand-hewing kind of fell out of favor because of technology and stuff. They still continue to do it up there. They're plain barns, the cedar shingle siding. We're down here, it's clapboards typically. Few manure basements, few cupolas. Almost all of them are separate from the house, which is interesting. The smaller barns are built with H-vents, and we'll get into that in a couple slides. And then here you go, Gene. English time joint. The larger barns are built with English time joint. So what is an English time joint, you may ask? Well, this is really fascinating. I was not aware of all this until I really delved into it. This barn is the Temperance Barn in Bridgeton, 1830. And this English time joint is this section right here. It's where the wall posts, the wall plate, the tie beam, and the rafter, they all come down here and get tied together. So it ties the building together in a very effective way. At the heart of the English time joint is this jowled post. And that took advantage of the natural taper of a tree. The carpenters were very clever with that. Because you have all this joinery going on up here, you need a wire section for your post. The post starts out square, but it flares ever wider as you get to the top. And the carpenter would just flip a tree, because the butt end of the tree is wider. They would flip that, so that would become the top of the post. And what's fascinating is how long this English tying joint held with carpenters of English descent. That's the Temperance Barn, and that's inside of it. It was really 500-600 years of unbroken. This was the standard in barn building for 500 or 600 years among those of English descent. And it's hard to think of something that would last that long today. 500-600 years. In fact, in England, they call this regular assembly. So if you find a barn like this, and I'm sure many in Otisfield that are hand-hewn frames, I'm sure many old ones have this. And you can look at that and you say, English people were here. This isn't German, this isn't French, this is English.
Don,
Yeah.
a cute story. I believe that's what my barn looked like in Michigan.
Yeah.
And I was raised with 5 brothers, and 4 of them were older than me, and I chased them, and we would run on that brace going across.
This
Inside
year?
the barn. No, the lower one.
This
That one. We'd run and have to get around that thing. That was the scary part. Barefoot. And then we'd get out the hole at the top and chase each other across the ridge outside and down and keep chasing each other.
Oh, wow.
As a kid, that's the way I lived.
Sounds like squirrels.
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting.
That's why I married her. I wanted a real farm girl.
Where you could chase.
That's fascinating. Okay. So, as I traveled the state, I kind of broke these frame styles down, and I discovered there are basically 3 types. This English tying joint with the jowled posts here. And you see the tie beam is right on top of the post. This next one is what we call an H bend. If you can imagine another post on the other side of the barn here, that makes kind of a letter H. But you notice the tie beam is dropped considerably. And then you get over here and you have a connected girt. You don't have a long wall plate at all. You have this kind of segmented thing. And these are square posts, okay? Whereas this is a tapered or jowled post. These are these are European in nature. Whereas this is American. This is a Yankee invention here. Just made things a little more simple when they had sawmill timber. This is all in my book. So, continuing with Maine farming, right? 1800. Beef and sheep were our principal livestock, and they all mentioned beef and wool were the big things. Dairy had not really come on the scene commercially yet. We had 31,000 barns at statehood. 1825, the Erie Canal opened. Now what does that do with barns? Well, that put a lot of pressure and competition on the Maine farmer that would only continue. This brought a lot of stuff from the Adirondack region, from Ohio. We have a very short growing season, rocky soil. So we were kind of up against it here. The first dairy cattle, 1854, some Jerseys came to Maine. Interesting, in 1850, the apple orchard was considered the best source of income for a farmer. And just before the Civil War, we had almost doubled the barns we had at statehood. Okay, now just after the Civil War, beef has largely disappeared in favor of dairy. Again, that was because of the competition. The Erie Canal, and then after the Civil War, the railroads were really going. And they brought the bread basket, they brought all that stuff over to our markets. And the Maine farmer was very, very much feeling it. So what did we do? We capitalized on what we had. We had a lot of cleared land, and we were a great grazing state. So dairy really saved farming in Maine. It really did. And it gave us our biggest, grandest barns. And in fact, if you think of people who maybe are still in farming today, they're probably in dairy. So the Dairymen's Association began there, and then the high point of farming, 1880. And we even shipped milk to Boston on iced rail cars. And so 1888, dairy is now our leading farm industry. Okay, so another section of the state that's kind of interesting to talk about is Aroostook County. Anybody grow up in Aroostook? Okay. I married a county girl, and we got to look at a lot of barns in that section of the state. What's interesting is almost all the barns up there are these gambrel roofed barns. These big, tall gambrel barns. Why is that? Well, Aroostook is a relative latecomer to the state, really. It was very isolated, and a lot of people were not up there early on. York County, our first county, was incorporated in the 1630s. It took another 200 years for Aroostook to get incorporated. It's 1830s, that Aroostook. So they were kind of late, so this is a later style barn. And they're very commercial up there. So these big buildings are very well suited to that. So characteristics of barns in Aroostook, they're big barns. Again, they're almost all post-1900, at least the ones still standing. Large scale for commercial use. You don't find the English time joint. And that makes perfect sense because that's French-Canadian kind of settlement pattern up there. They learn a lot of English up there. You do find hybrid frames of studs and heavy timbers. And that points back to this time frame. This is when timber framing started mixing with stud framing, and eventually stud framing carried the day. So it's interesting to see these hybrid frames up there. However, though, like Washington County, the hand hewing really lasted longer than it did down here. Most of the barns up there are detached from the house, just like Washington. A few manure basements, largely because that had fallen out of favor by the time we're looking at this period. And they were originally built for horses and hay, but after World War II, they soon transformed for tractors and equipment. Here's one in Aroostook. This one's 1935. It's about an hour north of Caribou. And it's just a beauty. It's got this original wood shingle roof. You would never see that down here. And this ladder is permanent. And that puzzled me at first. And I always ask folks during these talks, does anybody has any idea what that might be there for? I got one answer at a talk that sounds pretty good. One guy said that's how they repaired the roof. If they had a bad shingle somewhere, they'd climb that and maybe go out on the ridge and put a rope or something and come down to where that bad shingle was and fix it. Sounds pretty plausible to me. But it's beautiful. It's got this big fan window. It must have been gorgeous when it was all painted white. But again, this barn didn't see farming for too terribly long. 1935, and then World War II came, and everybody kind of turned over to mechanization, and it stopped being used for hay. This is inside that barn, and you'll see the kind of the hybrid frame I'm talking about, the heavy timbers and the studs here. And this is an H-bent. The tie beam is dropped, which seems to be the standard way they do it up there. But it's all hand-hewn in 1935. That is unique. And it's unique for this part of the state. We would never see that here. All of our barns by 1935 were sawmill timber. They were not hand-hewn at all. But you see now the boarding is horizontal, right? Because by 1930s, we're siding our buildings. Here's another barn in Aroostook. This one's from 1898. Very simple barn. Here's the inside of that. Everything in this barn is hand-hewn, everything. The braces, everything. Look at this brace here. And these rafters are basically just peeled poles. what's interesting is, see how narrow this boarding is? You know, down in this neck of the woods, we have the big pine boards, right? The pines are very much secondary up there, and mostly spruce and fir, narrower trees. Okay, well, let's talk about the rest of the state, right? Our neck of the woods a little more. Well, it's interesting that the gable entry, this is the barn we're familiar with, right? It's on a slope with for a manure basement, and a lot of them are attached to the house, right? Why is that? Well, I propose, because of one who studies barns, the rest of the state really had a wide range of time and transformation, and outside influences were more readily available. There were a lot of farm journals back in the 19th century that talked about barns and talked about the best practice for doing things. Should you side your barn to make it tight, or do you want it with just the boards so it can breathe? And there were arguments in both camps. So there was a lot of talk about barns in the 19th century. This one's in Shaker Village in Gloucester.
Don,
Yeah,
did anybody say they attached the barn to the house because of the snow?
that's a common belief, yeah. But, you know, Aroostook County has worse winters than we do.
We
And
didn't
Aroostook County
have
doesn't do
that.
that.
My barn wasn't attached and we had to put a rope, otherwise you got lost.
Yeah, yeah. Do you know what year your barn was?
I don't, it's no longer living here
Yeah.
as a house. But it was huge. Great stories with it too, by the way.
But I have a 2005 barn and I wish it were attached about January.
Yeah. Well, you know, the attached buildings had their advantages and disadvantages. You know, the advantage was, yeah, you could stay inside, but they also had disadvantages of fire. And in the late Victorian times, when they started learning about germs and disease, they didn't like the idea that they were sharing the same roof as their animals. And the germs could waft in to the house. And also, you know, your insurance guy doesn't like you to have attached to your house, right?
Right.
So some characteristics of barns in our area, right? We got a wide range of sizes. Dairy is very popular in this part of the state. Most are gable entry, many attached to the house. And we have a lot of manure basements. We have a lot of cupolas and fancy roof trim. We have a mixture of bed styles. But our hand-hewn frames really did cease right about the Civil War. Okay, after that, the sawmills had an affordable product, and it was easily transported on the railroad or whatnot. So this is an early barn, right? Maybe the first part of the 19th century. No siding, so it's drafty, right? The board shrank, the wind blew through. Well, the 19th century was really, like I say, was really the age of barns. And 50 years later, you know, you see us seeing just gorgeous buildings like this on the land. This is in New Gloucester. It's called a high drive bank barn. This ramp here is called a high drive. So they were using gravity and ramps and simple things like that to help their daily chores. You drive your hay in here, that much closer to the hay loft. You keep your animals here, so you just pitch the hay down, pretty easy. And when the animals are done with it, this is on a slope which continues down, they deposit it into the manure basement. So it all worked very nice. And you see now we have a cupola, nice siding on our building. It's only about 50 years' time to really transform it. There's a great quote that speaks to that. 1907, Maine Dairymen's Association meeting. I am here this evening to say a word of welcome to you who represent the happy homes of Maine. You are also representatives of the great dairy interests of the state. Dairying is today simply in its infancy. I remember when a boy, and some of you older ones can easily remember, the old barn with its great cracks, the scrub cow, the old milking stool. But a wonderful change has come as the years have passed by. Today we find the blooded cow. Today we find a better barn a better house. We find the barn shingled or clapboarded and painted, and a neatly kept lawn around the buildings. Everything has been progressing and advancing with great strides since you and I were boys, and I believe the future will see is great advance in this industry. So the blooded cow, right? They're breeding for milk production now. It's not just a family cow. You know, it's a commercial enterprise. Disease changed barns. Okay? TB was huge back 100 years ago. There are probably people in this room whose relatives died of TB. And this came on the state in a big way in the 1880s at the University of Maine, when the entire herd was found infected and they say simply slaughtered. We lost some barns this way. You know, they were at the fairs or the cattle auction or whatever, and, you know, the farmers would talk and they'd say, geez, Farmer Johnson's cows don't look too well. You know, and my cattle were there with his at the fair the other day. I think his cattle should be slaughtered, his barn burned. And they did that in some communities. They didn't know how else to get rid of it. So we lost probably some beautiful English pine joint barns to fire from that. So this brought on stuff like pasteurization, right? So 1895, the Portland Board of Health is now requiring milk to be tested, to have the cattle tested. And so 1830s, they largely got a handle on it. But the barns had to change. And it was really this period here. Well, the cow manure was found to be a host for TB. Okay, bovine tuberculosis was passed into the milk to the people contracted it. So that manure basement is not such a good idea anymore. So that's phased out. In fact, today, if you go by a dairy farm today, you'll see that they keep the manure completely outside of the barn in a big cement enclosure or another building entirely. The wooden floor was just a sponge for bacteria, so the washable cement floor was often mandated. And this put a lot of people out. This put a lot of small farmers out. They couldn't, you know, justify doing this. Interior lighting came in, and then the whitewash with the lime mixture. Basically, so you could see, oh my God, that wall has mildew all over it, whereas before you didn't really notice. Now you can see, and the lime was very much of an antiseptic. And the cupolas started going away in favor of the metal roof vents. And here's a barn in Bethel, a family who kind of went through this. It's a dairy family. This is the original barn, 1850s, has a hayloft, manure basement. They put this cattle tie-up addition on in the 1960s, and you'll see that almost nothing of a traditional barn is carried over. There's no big hayloft. It's right on cement, and flat ground. And I asked him, I said, how come your barn's all different shades of red? And he said, every spring Father would go down and get 5 gallons of barn red. And they kept changing the formula. I'm almost wrapped up here. There's some great old barn quotes that put all this stuff together. This place still stands. It's on Route 25 in Leamington. And I love the proportions of these old barns. It's almost like a circle. Nice and balanced. This is from a farm journal. The Maine Farmer was a farm journal, 1857. The building on the farm, which requires the most study and real good judgment to plan and to construct, is the one least thought of in this respect, and that is the barn. They kind of learned as they went. They just kept stuffing them full of animals. 1868, talk about stud framing. Necessity has done much for the building public by introducing to their favorable notice the balloon style, 2x-stud, of building wooden buildings. A style which is not well understood in the old, settled, and well-timbered portions of our country. Like Maine, we held on to our timber framing a lot longer than the rest of the nation did. And you've probably heard this term, balloon framing. Do you know where it came from? Well, it was a slam by the old carpenters guilds, the old guard. It was a slam of this new technology that they saw coming. The Chicago fire in 1870 really helped spur this along. You can think of the Chicago fire maybe like a Gulf hurricane today, where we want that city rebuilt as soon as possible. We want business to commence again. So all those buildings in Chicago had been put together the old way with pegs and mortise and tenons, and they had to have an army of apprentice joiners. It took forever, right? They didn't want to repeat that on the second time around, so they had studs and nails brought in, and guys put that stuff up much faster. So the old guard saw these walls being stood, these balloon framed, these stud walls, and they said, "Oh my God, that looks so light, it's like a balloon, it's going to float away." Where we get the balloon framing.
Don,
Yeah.
there's a difference between beams that were cut by circular saw and beams that were cut in these pits with upright. What's the difference in terms of vintage?
Yeah,
Those styles.
that's a good question. This here is a circular saw. You can see the arcing.
Yeah.
You know, it's not straight across. Scribner's mill, everybody knows that was a sash saw mill with a set. It wasn't in a pit. That was by hand. The pit sawing was by hand.
Yeah.
Very little of that happened here because we had a lot of streams and rivers for sawmills. But yeah, this is 1860 or later. Okay? Yep.
The balloon framing also had to do with starting at the base and going all the way up with no stops in between.
Right.
So the fire started down at your base of the building.
It's just
So
like a
you
chip.
follow right up those open spaces. And
Yeah.
it's now illegal building to do, but they stopped that by putting stops in like
Yeah.
between the studs. So
Yes. Blocking. Yeah.
It was true of houses too.
Yeah. Circular saws had been around before 1860, but they were used for small stock like lath or shingles or clapboards and stuff like that. They didn't start sawing timbers and boards until after 1860. And in some localities, it was probably much later. The Scribner's Mill continued till 1969, was it? You know, and he never modernized his machine. So, but for the most part, you can date a building that this is after 1960, this circular saw timber. Again, do you want your barn tight or should it breathe? They debated this back and forth, right? This is 1840s, pretty long way back. Tightening up. It is a very great and beneficial improvement in building barns to have them shingled down the sides as well as the roof. The extra expense is not so much as many people are ready to imagine, as there is considerable saving to be made in the quality of boards and nails where shingling is practiced. Besides, it keeps a barn warm and the frame dry. Therefore, I think there is no loss and considerable gain to be had by shingling the sides.
Question over here?
Oh, yes.
We used to raise sheep not too long ago, too many years ago, in Cape Breton, and we had to build a barn for our sheep.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of the early pictures of barns that you showed, where sheep farming would be predominant in Maine. Now, one of the absolute requirements when you have sheep is that you have super excellent ventilation. And so I believe that the spaces between your upright was there for a purpose. We didn't have to do that. We did it the modern way, super ventilation with modern soffits and such like that. But that ventilation had to go in because sheep get pneumonia if in cold weather, if they're in a cold and stuffy situation. It's better to have the wind whistling through for their health.
Well, that's very interesting. I hadn't heard that before. That's a good consideration. Sheep were huge in Maine.
Yeah,
It's a
early
huge
on,
industry. Yes.
when that kind of
Okay.
construction would occur.
Well, that's a good point. Well, okay, 1841 was that quote. And then we flash forward a decade or so. And they're talking, okay, they've tightened up their barns, now what, right? The breath from cattle, together with the vapor rising from the manure, covers not only the floor of the cellar, but the beams and the whole underside of the roof, with pearly trickling drops for weeks together during the winter. If the doors are thrown open in order to evaporate this moisture, you lose the benefits you have been seeking in making a tight barn by reducing this temperature so much that cattle require more food, while the effect is to reduce the flow of milk in the cows. Many large and valuable barns have been very much damaged by being placed over a manure cellar without proper ventilation. So if you're doing dairy, I guess they discovered some problems. So these cupolas are absolutely functional elements. And I think it would have been neat to see a barn just crammed full of animals on a cold, cold winter's day with one of these cupolas. It must have looked almost like a chimney with the vapor coming out. So they realized, if you tighten it up, you've got to ventilate. Okay, well, 1895. We've heard of urban renewal, or there was rural renewal back then. There was never a time in our state when there was so much inquiry upon and interest in the proper arrangement and construction of barns as is now abroad among our farmers. It is realized that there is money in a good barn, and that no one who proposes to put business methods into his management can afford to neglect this important attachment to his farm. Hence, up and down the state, farmers are modifying and building over their ill-planned structures or tearing them down to make room for the new and modern. So as historians, we lament this very much, getting rid of those old barns because it didn't suit the farmer to his needs. And after World War II, many farmers disliked their old barns. They couldn't drive their tractors in them. The beams were low, or there were posts in the way. So many farmers hacked their barns apart, and a lot of the buildings suffered as a result. Well, I think that's about it. I would welcome your questions.
I could just do a little anecdote about, I grew up right here in East Otisfield, half a mile up the road, and we have our barn. Neighbor's barn went down, unfortunately, several years ago. And we had Jersey cattle.
Yeah.
And we were, the two farms on either side, the Wiley farm over here and the Jolson binding barn over here, they had Holsteins.
Yeah.
Which I thought were pretty scary compared to our little blonde jerseys. But our barn is interesting. We have a lot of hand-hewn timbers, but we also have some sawn tilt timbers. It has vertical siding. It was shingled as I first remember it, and we've since re-shingled it.
Yeah.
And we were typical, I think, we were Jersey cattle. We made a little butter, sold a little milk to the milk truck came by and picked up at all of these farms. He was the biggest gossip in the area, knew everything about everybody because he'd been from barn to barn to barn. And had stories while he was loading up the milk. But it was a wonderful place to grow up here with these. There were several farms around, and they all disappeared around about the same time in the late 50s.
There's one right here, there's a barn there, and Bob Tracy back there.
It's too bad
We're the site of it.
Yeah, I can see one across there too. It's too bad that the dairy farmers now are really, really struggling.
In our time, it was coming through and demanding glass tanks instead of the cans of milk, which had a chilled cooler, and the concrete flooring instead of this wide planks or whatever. So it was an economic.
When you go back to your barn tonight, look at the timbers. You said you have a mixture of hand-hewn and sawn material. You may find the longest timbers are hand-hewn, whereas the shorter ones are sawn. Yeah. Oftentimes sawmills couldn't saw stuff much longer than 24 feet. So the carpenters still chose to hand-hew their long.
The big beams going
long
spanning
plates
the barn are all
yes.
the uprights, the big uprights are all hand-hewn.
Yeah, that can often explain the reason why you have the missillary stock types. You also, too, if you poke around barns around here, you find reused timber all the time.
Yes,
You find mortises that don't make sense.
that's true in our barn, but I think.
That's, you know,
People
this,
look at it and say, I don't understand that.
this was Maine, this is
Yeah.
Maine. People were struggling.
Yeah.
If they didn't have to hewing is hard work, I'll tell you. I tried it at a
And-
conference one time, and it is just
Yeah.
terrible. But when they saw the sawmill timber, they must have practically fallen down and prayed at it because it was a lot of work.
I could speak to that humidity in the barns in our tie-up when I was a kid. When you walked in there, you took your coat off because it was that hot, that warm from the cattle, and we had manure pit under the barn. And my
Yeah.
grandfather died at TV.
Really?
Yeah, he's a
Yeah.
young man in his 40s, so who knows whether he got it from the cattle or, you know,
Right.
but he sure was.
You know, people want to sell raw milk today, and I think that more power to them, only because we know you have to keep the manure away.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like it was. Sir?
You mentioned TB, but another devastating disease to dairy cattle was Bang's disease.
Yes.
My grandfather's cows got Bang's disease. They all had to be destroyed, and my grandfather got Bang's disease and was sick with it for a year.
Really?
What is Bang's disease?
The human version is under the feet.
Yeah, it's
Foot and mouth.
brucellosis. Brucellosis.
It almost killed my husband because he would not listen to me. I kept watching his temperature go higher and higher every month. He was in Africa.
Wow.
He got undulant fever, Bang's disease. And he said, no, my uncle had that. No. And it almost killed him.
Right. Stubborn.
Yeah.
That foot.
That's what made each other.
Yeah. I think we all have this experience that I experienced is driving through the countryside, seeing these big old farms with glorious barns that are just being let fall apart.
Yes.
Yes.
It's sad.
It's too bad. Dave, can you punch up this number 2 slide for me? I want
It's
to
an
just...
expensive proposition to preserve a barn, to sell
Oh,
a barn. It's
and you
really-
can't blame people if they're not using it.
Yeah.
They don't have use for it, it's hard
Right.
to justify
Yes.
the expense.
But I have noticed if you've ever driven to Quebec from here and you drive through northern Maine and you see all of these collapsing, junky, terrible looking barns and you cross the Canadian border and what happens? Beautiful, well-kept, painted, preserved barns. What's going on there? I think the government has something to do with it.
I'd like to point your attention to this slide again. This is that temperance barn, 1830s in Richmond. And you notice something about the front door?
Transom.
It's offset. You see the windows are symmetrical with the peak, but the door is offset just a little bit here to the left.
Huh?
Anybody know why that is? You can date a barn by this. This is a dead giveaway that you've got a barn typically before the Civil War.
You'd have to have space to slide the door. Is that a sliding door?
It's a sliding door, but
Yeah.
that's not the reason. They could have a swinging door and still be like this.
Okay.
Well, livestock is only so long, right? So you will always have your door offset. If it's an offset door, it will be offset towards the sunny side, the south side typically, and that's where you stable your animals. Your animals are only so long, so the farmer would say, okay, my animals are this long, and I want a path to walk behind, so I'll put my first row of posts right here. That would be an easy way for me to make my tie-up. I'll put my door here, and then the rest of the barn will be the big open space for the haymow. And you will find that there are no windows on the other side of the barn. Typically the north side or the sheltered side did not have the windows because you wanted to keep your hay cool, right? And you'd put your animals on the sunny side because in the wintertime you wanted them to get a little bit of light and help them be warm. So if you see this offset thing, it's neat. It's always offset to the sunny side, and they stopped doing it in the late Victorian times because I think this is just me, but I can't find any other reason for it, other than I think they liked everything very symmetrical. In Victorians, they liked it everything very balanced, very symmetrical. So this is a 4-foot offset. This is 12 feet here and a 16-foot here.
Is the side building, is that the milk room?
Yes. That was added later.
It doesn't go the whole length of the building, does it?
No,
Yeah.
no. That's a great old barn. They've preserved that, put a metal roof on it, this Historical Society. Well, anything else?
Did you happen to see the Stearns barn in West Paris?
Oh, that sounds familiar.
Oh, well, they did a fundraising to restore the barn, and that was maybe 10 years ago.
Oh, yes.
Ellen
yes.
Gibson?
Yes.
I wrote about her barn. What is it? Ellen Gibson?
Ellen
Yes,
Gibson.
right.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I knew I'd heard that sounded familiar. Yeah, I did a story about her for the Advertiser Democrat
Yeah.
series. Yeah, that's a nice place. They've got.
Oh, one thing about those ladders, my husband and I, it was either Nova Scotia or Scotland, and I think it was Scotland. They had those ladders on the roofs of buildings there too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Do they have the wood shingle roof?
I think so. They were tiles in some of the places in
Huh.
Scotland, and they had ladders, and some were, you know, it was quite common to see a ladder strapped to the roof and up the wall.
Yeah, that's neat. You don't see that down here.
Well, in Vermont, particularly with the Finn colonies, you often saw ladders on the roof, and a lot of it was to assist in putting out chimney fires.
This is-
Such like that, it wouldn't be too far away from the chimney or fire.
This is what I remember when my wife was talking about that. I remember it was explained to us once. I couldn't remember, but I do think it had to do with chimney fires.
Now we call the fire department.
Yes.
We owned a house and barn on Route 85 over in West Mills, and the front of the barn was an English barn with very fancy shingle work, really very, very elaborate. And I wondered if that indicated a time period or just prosperity as far as the builders, because the house was very old, 1840s.
Yeah,
But because I didn't see any of the barns here that had that kind of detail.
right. It's probably prosperity. Yeah.
Showing off just a little bit.
Yeah, you know, it's funny, you go around and you see just the public sides of barns were sided and a lot too, you know, and the back is really falling apart.
Yeah, they do that to houses in Maine.
I think, Don is ready to start selling.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.